Good evening, everyone. We'll be getting started in just a moment with Heather Pringle. We're going to give a minute to let everyone join us. All right. Good evening, everyone. I see we still have some people joining us, but we're going to go ahead and get started with our early announcements as people are joining. So first and foremost, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program with Canadian science writer Heather Pringle. Heather is joining us to talk about her new book, The Northwomen: Untold Stories from the Other Half of the Viking World. This is a fantastic book, by the way. I am looking forward to tonight's conversation to discuss the emerging evidence related to the role women played in Viking society. Now, if you're a fan of science or history, we have a number of upcoming author events that may just be right for you. On April 2nd, Johns Hopkins University professor Daniel Stone will share the amazing story of Alice Hamilton, who took on the booming auto industry for leaded gasoline and how it made people ill. We'll also have travel writer Mike Tidwell on Thursday, April 10th, to talk about his year-long examination of the willow trees in his Washington, D.C. neighborhood and what their changes mean for our climate. And finally, this is one I'm really excited for. We'll host science writer Lisa Barrell on April 17th to talk about archaeological discoveries, mummies, and artifacts that are now emerging from melting glaciers. So for a full list of all of our upcoming programs, please visit our website at hudsonlibrary.org. I also encourage everyone to join tonight's conversation. Whether you are a professional, a novice, you don't know anything about Vikings, it doesn't matter. Please submit any questions you may have for Heather using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen, and we'll go through questions at the final part of tonight's program. In addition, I encourage all of you to grab a copy of The Northwomen. There is so much detail in this book, seriously. We're not going to be able to cover everything, all of the roles and archaeological evidence that's currently in discussion and debate regarding women and Viking culture. So you can pick up your copy. They're available for purchase courtesy of Hudson's own independent bookstore, The Learned Owl. And in just a moment, I'll put a link in the chat for easy purchase. So now I'd like to introduce tonight's guest. Heather Pringle is a science journalist who specializes in archaeology. She's the author of 4 other books and hinted to me just a moment ago that she's writing fiction right now. And her feature articles have appeared in numerous publications, including National Geographic Magazine, Science, Discover, Scientific American, and Archaeology. She's also the co-founder of the science blog, The Last Word on Nothing. So let's go ahead and move to tonight's discussion. Heather, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you, Kelsey, for inviting me. I'm just delighted to be here this evening. I really am.
Great. I'm really delighted too. As you know, maybe people in the audience don't know, they just know me as a librarian. But I am very excited because I actually do have a bachelor's degree in archaeology. Originally was going to go in a career path for museums, but I'm now in libraries. So I don't get to talk about archaeology every day. So I'm very excited. And to be honest, the stories and the evidence behind Viking history, they've changed so much since I graduated with my degree in archaeology in 2011. Now, everyone in this chat and this group tonight, they may have different knowledge and levels of knowledge regarding Vikings. And putting the emerging stuff that your book talks about aside, can you just give us a little bit of a general timeline and way of life of Viking culture, just so we kind of all have like a baseline to work with here tonight?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, here's a quick primer on the Vikings. So the Vikings lived in Scandinavia. They lived in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden originally. And they were an agrarian society. They were farmers and they raised livestock. They grew wheat and oats and barley. But they were also very oriented towards the sea because Scandinavia has a very long coastline. And so they were seafarers. They were incredibly adept seafarers. But interestingly enough, and I want to mention this one thing, they were also very adept at river travel. And this will become important later on when we talk a little bit about their travels in the East. But they were also very adept. They built river boats as well as seagoing ships that we call longships today. So they were an agrarian society. They were a very stratified society. There were chieftains and a few kings at the top of the hierarchy. At the bottom of the hierarchy, there were enslaved people. So, as I say, quite a stratified society. They basically, we consider the Viking Age to have begun around AD 750. Um, and the Viking Age kind of slowly wound down. It's a little bit more difficult to give you a hard and fast date for it, but let's just say the late 11th century. So after 1050, for several decades after that, the Vikings start to wind down. So that's roughly the period that we're talking about. That's a period that in other parts of Europe might be called medieval, the medieval period. And so that's a quick picture of who the Vikings were.
Right, and that's more than enough to get us started for tonight's talk. We were discussing before we get started that many people learn about ancient cultures through media, television, movies, and things like that. And Viking culture in the media is always very heavy, focused on men, warriors, things like that. And the women, it's like maybe have like about regarding more like the Norse mythology, Valkyries, things like that. And
Mhm.
it's interesting to me because there's a lot of ancient societies around the world that did have females in power that we're okay with. Easily, you think about Cleopatra in Egypt.
Mhm.
Um, why is it that the Viking women have been hidden for so long?
Okay, that's your $1 million question. What is going on here? So the problem was that the Vikings didn't really leave us a written history. The Vikings tended to be masters of the spoken word as opposed to the written word. They did have a writing system, the runic system, so carving runes, which are sort of letters, on pieces of wood or on stone, but they were very, very short texts. You might think of them as being akin to a tweet, sort of 140 characters. Well, not exactly, but very, very short. And so they didn't write books. So we don't have any, histories of Viking women. We don't have any diaries that were written by Viking women. History is actually not that helpful when we want to see who the Viking women were. We do have stories called sagas or the Icelandic, some people call them the Icelandic sagas, just to be a bit succinct here tonight. I'm just going to call them the sagas. And the sagas give us a portrait of some Viking women, powerful Viking women, but the problem is they're stories. So they were stories that were passed down for generations in Scandinavia over those long Scandinavian winter nights around the hearth. Storytellers would tell tell a story about events, maybe the history of a royal house, but often events or mythologies. And so there's a whole um, stew pot full of mythology, storytelling, fiction, and some fact. And how do you tell which is which in the sagas? It's very difficult. So although we have strong women in the sagas, archaeologists and a lot of other specialists have said, no, we can't go by what the sagas tell us on their own. We need to we need to verify. And one way of verifying is through archaeology. So that's, that's kind of the evidence that I really relied on primarily in this book. Although I did bring in the sagas and other forms of evidence when it seemed appropriate.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think is very interesting is that while evidence is being found that can challenge theories, your book describes Viking women traditionally being held in a private life, meaning they do things at the home and not so much out and about in the world. But as evidence is forming that shows that women had much more of a public role than we have discussed, these have been kind of challenged and at times very controversial. Now, that's nothing new in the archaeological world. There's many times that we will have archaeologists have different views and interpretations of everything from an excavation dig to testing of evidence. But I feel like it's much more controversial with the Vikings. Do you agree with that? And if so, what is with the Viking experts?
I completely agree with you. And I'm hard pressed, I'm a little hard pressed myself to really answer that. However, I would suggest, this is just my own personal thought on this, that because Vikings are such a kind of have this strongly macho image, an image absolutely steeped in testosterone, it's been harder for Scandinavian specialists on the Vikings, it's been harder for them to accept, I think, evidence that women actually played key parts in the Viking world. And, I think it's also just that, it was male Scandinavian archaeologists who dominated the field for so very long. It's only fairly, relatively recently, certainly since the Second World War, and in my own experience, I think I was telling you this before we started, I've been writing about archaeology now for more than 4 decades. And when I first started going to conferences, there were hardly any women there to present papers or to take part in the conference, archaeological conferences. Now there's tons of women there. There's at least 50%. Sometimes it seems to me that there's even more, 60% or whatever. So things have changed radically. And I think as women have entered the profession, they have asked questions that the older archaeologists didn't think of asking, the older male archaeologists didn't think of asking. And in a way, it's been a bit challenging for the older archaeologists, I think, having these young female archaeologists coming in and saying, yeah, but what about women traders? What do you think about this? And so there's just been difficulties with that, I think.
Absolutely. I know that the world of archaeologists and anthropologists in general has, a bit of a tainted history when you look at it, because it did start mostly with people doing it more as a hobby, with
Mhm.
hobbyists instead of turning into a profession. So there are some issues with that over time. And so I do think, though, as more people are coming into the profession and they're bringing different perspectives, it's allowing us to look at things with a different lens. And I think that that's really important to do. And again, all these things are up for interpretation. Everyone has their different views about it, but it's good to have that dialogue, I think.
Oh, I couldn't
Um,
agree. Yeah, I agree with you.
yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely. So, with my archaeology background, there were things I was really connected to and like drew me to wanting to learn more. I can talk your head off about like Mesoamerican temple masks, but we will not do that tonight. Um, but I am sure there was something that really sparked your interest when to
Mhm.
start this project. And would you like to kind of share that with everyone tonight? Like, what started you on this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what really grabbed my attention was something that I saw on a trip that I made to Oslo. I was in Oslo to attend a conference, and I decided to nip out at one point. There was a kind of a social program, and as part of the social program, they offered a tour of the Viking ship museum, and I thought, wow, I can't not do that. I mean, how many opportunities do I have to go and see Viking ships? So I went there, I walked through the door, and right as you walk through the door of this museum, there was this immense ship, 70-foot long ship, Viking longship, an authentic original Viking longship built probably in the late 8th century. There it was on display, and it was called the Oseberg ship. And the Oseberg ship had been used as a burial chamber. It had been towed onto the land, and it had been um, used during a funeral to bury two individuals. And then it had been, and so during the funeral ceremony, all kinds of treasures had been put inside the ship, had been buried inside the ship. The ship itself, I should just backtrack a moment. It was magnificently carved. I mean, the amount of workmanship that went into these carvings of little creatures, like strange little supernatural creatures crawling all over the ship and so on. It was just amazing. It was beautiful and amazing. And the ship was, as I say, used as a burial chamber. It was filled with treasures, and then it was buried. It was buried down beneath an earthen mound. And in 1903, it was discovered by archaeologists. And it was realized fairly soon after the excavation that the two individuals buried in that ship um, were women. And this is the most lavish burial known in the Viking world. The Oseberg ship burial is it is the most spectacular burial of all the burials in the Viking world. And here it is, two women, not two men, not two, not a chieftain and whatever. It's two women. And that really got me thinking. And I thought, wow, I'm missing something here, because my image of the Vikings were these big burly men, just as you mentioned, kind of, bearded with a broad axe slung over their shoulder, that kind of thing. I've been missing something, because here we have two very, very powerful women buried in this ship. Who were they? So that was the beginning of my quest. And I spent, several years trying to, trying to learn more about Viking women.
Absolutely. And for anyone who hasn't, she does include a picture of the ship in the
Yes,
book. I had her even
thank
pull
you.
that out. And there's a great even Wikipedia article about this ship and this burial, because it was so surprising to have women in this ship. So who are these women? Are they a queen? Are they royalty of some kind? Are they, and there's been lots of theories based on what was found with them.
Mhm, mhm,
And a lot of that can tie into theories regarding the use of magic.
mhm.
And so I was
Yes.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role magic played in Viking culture and why magic was such a female dominated activity.
Sure, yes, absolutely. Well, the Vikings were really, as Neil Price, who is one of the world's foremost specialists on the Viking Age, as he told me, the Vikings were really into magic. In the sagas, for example, there are numerous stories of women, and I'll come to why that is in a moment, but numerous stories of women performing acts of magic. Now, when I say magic, I'm not talking about sort of hat trick type magic. I'm talking about something that we might today call sorcery or even witchcraft. And so it is something that was performed in order to divine the future, or to bring good luck or good fortune or bad fortune onto somebody. There was even something called battle magic, and the Vikings really believed in this. In fact, Neil Price said to me that battle magic was even more important in Viking warfare than sharpening your sword. You had to have battle magic on your side before you went into battle. And so this was a very strong belief. And so in battle magic, the belief was a sorceress who could wield the enchantments of battle magic, could change the course of a battle. She could bring victory to one Viking lord and defeat to another, and so on. So there was a very strong belief in magic. So Neil Price, I keep mentioning his name because he's written this huge book on Viking magic, which was originally his PhD dissertation, but which he's expanded considerably since then. What he did was he read through the sagas. He took careful note of what it was that sorceresses, the tools of their trade, so to speak. What was it that they carried around with them when they performed their magic? How, what were the props and tools, and how did they dress, so on and so forth. So he took careful notes in the sagas of all this, all these descriptive passages. And then what he did was he went into burial records and looked to see if there were examples of any women who were buried with these objects. And I'll just explain very briefly. Some of the objects included a staff. You might think of a magic wand, for example, but the staff was essential to the identity of a magic worker. In fact, it was so essential that the Old Norse word for a sorceress was staff carrier, staff bearer. So the staff was essential, and they used it in their ceremonies. So that was one thing that was very, was closely associated with these women. Plants that, could be used as mind-altering plants, psychotropic plants. That was another tip-off. And there were several kinds of things that sort of related to it, including the way the women dressed. These women dressed in very unusual ways. There's one very long passage in the Saga of Eric the Red, interestingly enough, which describes a sorceress who's wearing a cloak that has gems right from the top of the cloak right down to the hem at her feet. So, I mean, that is a very unusual garment for the Viking Age for a woman to have. And so these were some of the tip-offs that one might find: amulets, magical amulets, and so on. And I'm going to go back now to the point about why women. Well, the goddess who was sort of the originator of magic was a goddess by the name of Freya. And Freya was a goddess of prosperity and many things, but she was also the goddess of magic. And she was the one who taught magic to the god Odin, god of war, and many other things as well. And so she was sort of the originator of magic. And women practiced magic. Magic was almost exclusively the province of women, because men felt that if they used magic, for example, on the battlefield, that was sort of cheating. Instead of fighting with their swords, to be fighting with sorcery seemed to be kind of cheating. It wasn't a manly thing to do. So you would find very few male, sorcerers. Instead, the magic workers are almost entirely women. So, okay, so this is all background to what do we find in the Oseberg ship, and why do we think that those women may have been sorceresses, or at least one of them. Well, there is a rod, a staff in the Oseberg ship. It was in this very ornate chest, very special chest in the burial chamber. And it's a very special kind of rod. It's very finely polished and worked. And it matches the description of a special type of sorceress's staff that was used only by the supreme practitioners of this form of sorcery. And it was used to break or tame the human will. Pardon me. I'm just going to take a drink here. To tame or break the human will. And here we find it. Here we find one of those staffs in the Oseberg ship. The Oseberg ship is also full of ritual objects, including these very kind of bizarre carved heads of mythical creatures. There are tapestries in the Oseberg ship, very, interesting tapestries that show rituals that were given in honor of Odin, but show what we think now are sorceresses carrying their staffs. And there are, mind-altering drugs in the Oseberg ship. There are seeds of cannabis, which is pretty interesting. And I think one of the most intriguing parts of it is that the Oseberg ship, unlike, most archaeologists think, well, the ship burials, these ship burials that the Vikings are known for, the ships were intended to convey the dead person to the, to the other world, that these ships were intended to convey something. Well, that ship at Oseberg wasn't intended to convey those two women anywhere. It was moored to a huge boulder in the trench before it was buried, so that those women were not going to be going anywhere. And that's because there was a belief in the Viking world that a dead sorceress could see into the future, could see more clearly into the future than even the gods could. So that community that buried the Oseberg women in such style, they wanted to keep at least one of those women close by so they could go and, see if she could give, even as a dead woman, give counsel to them at times of need, in times of need.
Really impressive. And I think it's interesting how the interpretation of this particular site has changed since it's been found, especially due to changes in technology and our abilities. And if I do remember correctly, it's just an aside, but the one person who was on the ship did have like a genetic disability, if I'm correct, right? And that could make things a little bit more complicated, maybe for some people who were analyzing it maybe at one point.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So she has a genetic syndrome that can produce secondary male characteristics. So in other words, she might well have, we can't say for absolute certain, but she may well have had a beard, for example, a secondary, that's one of the secondary male characteristics. She may have had a deep voice. This genetic anomaly produces obesity in older females. So she may have looked very different. She may have looked otherworldly. That's how I think of her in my mind, because this deep voice, perhaps a male beard, but female characteristics too, very obese. I'm thinking that they regarded her as being someone who had special access to the other world. She was otherworldly looking, and she had special access to the spirit world. That's what I
Yeah.
think.
I absolutely can understand that theory. And like I said, with the advances in technology and being able to do things like this and to make those types of tests, those are discoveries that we had no idea about, earlier before. So I think that's really great. You talked a little bit just now about funerary customs and burying people with things. And that was always one of my favorite things learning about, because you learn so much when you study a culture and their funerary customs and what they decide to bury with. And it was more than just these women that were buried with items. In fact, a lot of what we've learned about with women and various trades was based on what they were buried with. And that could be of various stratification levels too. Do you want to talk a little bit about other types of trade evidence we have that's been found in graves with women?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So, for example, in this, I'll go back to the sagas just very briefly. I'm coming back to the burials right away, but in the sagas, we have no evidence that women were ever traders, merchants or traders. There's seemingly no stories about women traders or merchants. However, in the 1990s, a Norwegian archaeologist by the name of Anne Stalsberg, very interesting woman, decided to take a look in the burials in a town called Berka in Sweden. And it was an early town, it was an early Viking town, and it was a trading town. Its whole raison d'etre was for trading. And so Anne Stelsberg took a look at, by this point, there had been well over 3,000 or 4,000 burials uncovered in Berka. And Anne Stelsberg went through the burial records to see what archaeologists had found in the graves of the individuals who had been excavated. And what she discovered was really, really interesting. So she found in 132 graves in Berka evidence of trading activities. And by evidence of trading activities, she found a trader's scale or trader's weights or other tools, part of the toolkit that traders used. And I just need to backtrack a little bit, because the Vikings had something called a metal weight economy. And what this means is that, let's say I'm a buyer and let's say you're a seller, and I go to you and I say, gee, I really like that, this piece of jewelry that you made. I'd like to buy it. And I'm going to offer you a set weight of silver. Let's say I'm making this up now, 1 ounce of silver. I'm going to give you 1 ounce of silver for this in exchange for that beautiful piece of jewelry you made. And you say, okay, that sounds fine to me. So what you would do next as a trader is you would pull out your portable scales. There'd be two little pans on a set of, scales of justice kind of thing. 2 little pans, and on one pan, the buyer puts the silver, because everything is conducted in silver by weight. And the merchant puts a weight that is equivalent to the weight that was agreed upon. And so when the pan is leveled out, that means that the correct amount of silver has been produced. So, okay, so traders really didn't go anywhere without their scales, their portable scales, and their weights. Absolutely essential to trade. And so when Anne Stelsberg, the Norwegian archaeologist, was looking through the burial records, she was looking for evidence of scales and weights, and also sometimes coins as well. And what she found, 132 graves, and of those 132 graves, 32% of them were graves of women that could be identified as the graves of women. 32% had, traders' scales and weights and so on. Only 28% of those graves were the graves of men. Now that left 40%, and that 40% consisted of graves of couples. So it wasn't clear, who, which member of the couple had the scales, or bodies that could, or skeletal remains that could not be identified according to sex. So 40% couldn't be identified, but 60% could be identified by sex. And of those, 32% were women. A larger percentage were women than men. And I just found that fascinating. Like, and it makes sense that women would be involved in trade. I mean, they might have been members of a merchant house, and they may have traveled with their husbands. I mentioned earlier that the Vikings were very adept at river travel as well as ocean travel. So, the Vikings were traveling in the east in places like Russia and Belarus and Ukraine and so on. They were traveling on the river systems. And we know that Viking women were on some of these trips. We have descriptions by other travelers seeing Viking women in these places. And we also have burials of Viking women and Viking men, I might add, in towns or in settlements, I should say, along these river routes. So there were women traders Viking women traders in Russia and in Ukraine as well. So yeah, that it wasn't just men that were doing this, it was women as well.
Absolutely. And so, as you mentioned, some of these women have been documented actually traveling along rivers, so more mobile. But is there evidence, maybe because not everyone might not know in attendance tonight, have there been archaeological sites found that give evidence to like market houses that were like static at all for Viking culture, where like there were like areas of commerce like within a community?
Yeah.
Was okay.
Yeah, exactly. So the market town that I mentioned earlier,
Mhm.
Berka, this place in Sweden. Yes, there was, and that whole town was really devoted to trading and trading. Traders ships from various other parts of the Viking world would arrive, and then there'd be traders on the docks, and there would be trading going on in Berka and in about a small handful of other towns in Scandinavia as well. There were trading centers as well in other parts of Scandinavia. And then, as I say, in these, in the east, along the river systems in Russia and Belarus and Ukraine, there were trading settlements in these places as well, where there were, Vikings were living there and they were trading in these places as well. So yes, there were markets per se, absolutely.
Absolutely. Now we will get in a little bit to one of the more controversial graves and what was found in it, and it completely opens an eye to some of the things women were doing. We'll get to that one because
Okay.
that was a hot topic when that one first came out in 2017. But the women were not just traders, but we have evidence that the women were artisans and they were makers and weavers, and that was
Oh,
huge
yeah.
and needed because of the ships and the amount of wool needed.
Yeah.
And so, how do we find evidence about women involved with like the weaving and the textile work?
Yeah, I mean that actually was one of the really wonderful parts of the research for me, because I hadn't been aware of this aspect of Viking life at all. But when you think about it, when you see the Viking longships, on the History Channel or in various documentaries and so on, you see these immense cloth sails, and some of these sails are the size of, let's say, 20 king-size beds pushed together, right? They're enormous. Now, some of the sails, the cloth does not preserve all that well in archaeological sites. We know that because it's very fragile, it's organic, and it deteriorates very quickly. And after, you know, 900 years and more, the cloth basically deteriorates and basically just disappears in a lot of graves. It's a special grave that preserves cloth. But by some wonderful kind of fluke, some sailcloth was discovered in the rafters of a church in Norway. And it was discovered, several years ago. I think it was in the 1990s, I think late 1990s. And little bits of of this cloth had been stuffed into the ceiling of a church in order to prevent rain from coming in, and been kind of jammed into the roof tiles and so on. Anyway, archaeologists found this sailcloth in this church. Some of it was just in the attic and some of it was underneath the tiles of the church. But it turned out to be cloth that was made around 1300. That was after the Viking period ended, but it's the oldest sailcloth that can be definitively identified as sailcloth in all of Scandinavia. And there have also been little bits of cloth that closely resemble it. In the Oseberg ship, there was bits of cloth, and in a few other places they have found tiny bits of cloth. But the cloth from Norway that I'm mentioning here was these were fairly large pieces, and people could study them and see exactly how they were made. And they were made by women, because at that time, women were the weavers of, in the Viking world, it was women. Women processed wool. They were the ones that had the expertise to know, which kind of wool to pluck from sheep, how to process it, how to spin it, and how to weave it on these big horizontal looms that they were using. And it was, oh man, it was a complicated piece of work, and it required a lot of skill to be able to create big swaths of cloth that could then be sewn into, areas the size of 20 king-size beds. Anyways, this was women's work. This was traditionally women's work. We don't have evidence that men were involved in weaving. We don't have any really good saga evidence, so it's women's work. And here we are in modern times. The Viking Ship Museum in a place called Roskilde, Denmark, has been very active in experimental archaeology. What they have done is they have created this huge program to recreate authentic Viking ships based on archaeological data of various sorts, shipwrecks that have been found at the bottom of the ocean of Viking ships and so on. And so at Roskilde, people who are artisans, modern day artisans, reconstruct, the hulls of Viking ships and so on. And Roskilde, the Viking Ship Museum, they recruited women weavers to recreate the sailcloth. And it was an enormously laborious process. And some of the researchers at the Viking Ship Museum kept logs of how much time things took and so on. And in fact, calculations now show that to make just one Viking sail, one large Viking sail, would have taken around about more than 10,200 hours of labor. And a lot of the Viking ships carried spare sailcloth in case of an emergency, in case something happened to their sail. They had enough spare cloth to make a second sail. And so these ships may have been carrying cloth that would have taken 20,000 hours of work. I mean, it's just enormous amounts of labor. And this is all women's work. So it was women who were, intimately involved in creating the fleets of Viking ships, creating the sailcloth for the Viking ships that were raiding, trading, and making war and so on. Viking women were, intimately involved in these processes.
Right. And if I remember correctly too, like from the time of like constructing the boat in general, like the cloth takes up so much of the time.
Yeah, 33%, I think it was, close to 33% of the total amount of hours. required to create a whole Viking ship with its sail. Yeah.
That is an impressive amount of time. Like, I'm just trying to even imagine that. That required a lot of hands. And so obviously a lot of women were
A
involved
lot
in
of,
that. Yes.
absolutely. I think of it as an army of women. I really
No,
do.
I
Yeah.
know. So like that was really their role because they were making the weaving the sails for the ships. They also were working and creating leather, well, creating armor
Yeah.
for warriors.
Yes.
But like to get people excited. We also though have evidence from one very kind of controversial
Mhm.
grave that we have evidence of a female warrior herself who was actually
Mhm.
on the battleground.
Mhm.
And that one was very, and for context, the DNA was released just in 2017. So this isn't even that long ago, but it is still that controversial. And when I brought that up to you at the beginning of this program about why it's so controversial, this has not ended in terms of the Scandinavian experts having strong opinions, we'll leave it at that, about
Mhm.
what is and is not the women's roles in their society. Um, were you covering this as it unfolded with the woman warrior?
Yes, I was. I was absolutely covering it as it unfolded because I I was actually in Scandinavia, and I had coffee with one of the archaeologists one Sunday morning she had offered very kindly to take me out to Berka to show me this town that I've been mentioning. And she said, gee, by the way, I've got something to show you. Now, I also have something, which this is the most recent issue of National Geographic. This is the subscriber's copy. Now, what she showed me was, I don't know if you can see this, but it is a photo of a it is a photo of an engraving that was made of a warrior's grave. And I don't know if you can see it, but it's absolutely jam-packed full of weapons. So there are 2 spears, there are 25 arrows, there are 2 shields, there's a battle knife for close combat, for fighting close combat. There's all these weapons in this grave, and the grave was discovered in the 19th century. And the archaeologist who excavated it said, this is the grave of a very important Viking warrior. So the grave is at Berka, this very famous town that I've been telling you about. And the grave was found very close to a military garrison. It was practically right next door to the military garrison in Berka. And an ideal place to bury a very distinguished warrior. So basically, this idea that it was the grave of a male warrior persisted right from 1870s right up to 2017. This team of Swedish researchers conducted a DNA study on this very famous warrior. And what happens is, lo and behold, this warrior, the DNA reveals that the body in the grave belonged to a female, and so, we don't know how the female presented herself necessarily. This female was buried with remnants. I mean, she was buried in a full outfit, but we can find remnants of it, of a Eurasian style riding jacket. She was buried with, as I say, a full arsenal of weapons, buried with 2 horses. She's buried with a lot of equestrian equipment. And it may well be the archaeologists who led the team who excavated, who did the DNA study, pardon me, who did the DNA study. She feels that this woman in the grave was probably a mounted warrior. And National Geographic, this article that has just appeared in the March issue of National Geographic, I'm just going to show you the most recent. I hope you can see this. This is the illustration of the warrior woman.
Mhm.
Can you see that okay,
Yep.
Kelsey?
If you want to go ahead and show it again, yep, we can see it.
Okay, great.
Mhm.
So there she is on horseback, riding into battle. She's got her quiver of arrows on her back, and very fierce expression on her face. And that's sort of where that's kind of how we're starting to see her. As you say, it's still stirring controversy. Some people have suggested, well, maybe there was a male body in the grave that was robbed, and taken out of the grave at some point, leaving only a female who had nothing to do with weaponry, kind of thing. But that doesn't seem very plausible because she's in the very center of the grave. I mean, it's she's in the very center of the grave. It seems as if she is the main owner and occupant of that grave. And the idea of being a mounted warrior is plausible because there were mounted warriors in the East, in these areas that I was mentioning, in Russia and Ukraine. There was a long tradition of that, and it may be that some of the Viking warriors in Berka, who may have been guarding merchant convoys in the East, may have learned, from the steppe warriors there at the time, how to be mounted archers. It's quite possible. So she may have been one of these mounted archers herself. She may have been taught how to, fire arrows while she's riding horseback. And one last thing I'm going to say about this is when I've interviewed a mounted archer who would happen to be an expert on ancient DNA in Germany, Angela Graf, and she told me that that the equestrian sports are the only sports in the Olympics in which males and females compete against one another. And that's true of mounted archery events in general. Males and females compete against each other today because there are still mounted archery events. And so it's quite possible that this woman was a mounted archer, and that would have leveled the playing field. That would have leveled, that made it possible for a woman to survive in this very intense world of Viking combat.
Right. With that type of battle tactic, it can kind of definitely give you a level hand then. There's just so many, and we aren't even covering everything in your book, from landowners. There's just so many different categories, both good and bad, we'll be honest. Like there were some women who did not have a good time in Viking world. But the reality is that the story is constantly changing, and you've been covering archaeology now, like you said, for 40 years. And so what I was curious from you is, as a science writer, do you feel that we will continue to find more pieces to the puzzle? And if so, what types of puzzle pieces do you hope we find? Like, is there certain types of artifacts you're hoping we find, or is it just maybe certain types of clues? What would be your dream to find?
Well, what I would really, I'm sure we are going to find more. Long story short, to answer your first part of your question, I'm sure we're going to find more because I think now that the Pandora's box is open, so to speak, and now that people are thinking, well, maybe we should start looking to see whether there are other, women warrior or other, women traders and, women taking part in other activities that were previously deemed to be only men, for men. I think just the mere fact of being open to that possibility and looking for the first time, instead of saying, oh no, women were just, staying at home, I think that will open the doors for other discoveries for sure. I'm fully expecting it. And in terms of what I would love to see, I would love to see more evidence of women warriors. I gotta say, I think because it is so counterintuitive, the Viking poets really painted this sort of hellish picture of Viking warfare. They called it spear storms and army reddening, and they have this, this language that they used for battle that really paints the full horrors of it. And so for me to think that there were women who were strong enough and tough enough and capable enough to survive in that environment, I find that really kind of, I don't know, personally for me, it's inspirational. It is. And, I think, as we go on and more graves are tested, there are something like at least 30 graves that have been identified as being potentially females buried with weapons. I think as more research is done on some of these graves, we may see others come to light.
Absolutely. We're going to move into audience questions in just a moment. I see we already have one in, but please feel free to submit your questions since we have about 10 minutes left or so. But I do have one last question for you. First, a compliment. As I told you before, I think as someone with an archaeology background, this book is extremely accessible and interesting. A lot of
Thank you.
archaeological texts can be extremely dry or too focused in academia. And I just really would like to ask you, what is your goal that you would hope people reading your book, at least one thing that they will take away from this book and all your research that you did?
Well, I think I suppose my goal is actually to show that the past was not as straightforward or as simple as what we sometimes think, where men were out hunting, hunting and doing all the male kind of activities, and then there were a set of very different female activities, and that everything was black and white. Things were not black and white in the past. I mean, I certainly discovered that in other articles I've written about other cultures, and they certainly were not black and white in the Viking Age. And I think that it's really important, if we ever really want to understand who the Vikings were, we need to be able to see, what the Viking men were doing, certainly, but also what were the Viking women doing. And we need to put both halves of that picture together. Otherwise, we're missing an awful lot. And so that's my goal.
Absolutely. So let's see, we'll go ahead and start questions. So Linda has one. I'm not sure if you're going to have the expertise on this, but maybe you can, or we'll know where to point her. Linda is very interested in Viking design elements as they may have come down to us in contemporary Scandinavian design. Do you know of any resources, websites, or anything, or a book even, that she could look into to learn more about that? She's a historian and she has roots in Norway and can't wait to read your book.
Well, that's lovely. So sorry, you said flaking design? Sorry.
She said that she is a historian. She has roots in Norway and
Yeah,
she
but
can't wait to read.
her interest was in design or
Yeah.
flake
Yeah,
just
design elements that came
ah,
down into contemporary Scandinavian design.
oh, okay. Well, oh, that's a tough question, actually. I'm not really sure if I've got I can point her in any particular direction. I mean, I mean, if, a general history on the Vikings, some of the more illustrated histories of the Vikings, would give her some of the designs. I mean, certainly on the Oseberg ship, you were showing an illustration. I don't have one right handy here, but I mean, some of the designs on that ship, the spiral designs and a lot of the kind of very kind of Scandinavian designs on that ship and on some of the other artifacts might be of interest to her, and that might be a starting place for her. So if she Googles Oseberg ship, and it's spelled Oseberg, that might be a place to start.
And we have some of the detail carvings also in the book, as you can see right here from the ship
Mhm,
itself, which is absolutely amazing, way better than anything I could do.
mhm.
Let's see, do we have any other questions? Let's see. So I'll give everyone a moment in case anyone else wants to submit any questions. If people want to keep learning more about Viking culture, what are some resources that you would really point people towards, especially if they're not necessarily like a professional archaeologist and have access to the literary journals?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would really suggest, I mean, there are reenactment societies. There are reenactment societies in several parts of the United States. Um, those are, you know, those aficionados are very dedicated, and they attempt to make very authentic costumes for the reenactments. They attempt to, authentic kind of swords and so on. They do markets often at the reenactment festivals. I would highly recommend those. I mean, those are great places. And of course, you've got people, who have done a lot of research and who are willing to tell you about, well, I'm wearing this kind of brooch because this kind of brooch that a Viking woman would have worn at this period and so on. And they're more than happy to engage in a lot of conversation about that. Those engagement or reenactment festivals would be a great place for people to start. And there are museum exhibits, online museum exhibits that would certainly be of interest. Google online exhibits, especially from the Scandinavian museums. And there's a number of general books, that I really like. Neil Price has written a book called Children of Ash and Elm, and that's Neil Price, Neil Price, Neil Price, Children of Ash and Elm, and that's a great book. I would highly recommend that book, and it's written for regular readers, not for necessarily for academics, but regular readers. So I would recommend that too.
You could probably pick that up from your local library if you're
Yeah.
interested. So,
Yes.
and last but not least, for the readers who want to read more from you, where's the best place to find you and keep up with everything you're doing? Because you are working on more projects. This isn't the end. You've been writing for so many different publications. So how can people keep track of you?
I've got a website, and they could always check in there. My website is just heatherpringle.com. And yeah, come pay a visit and see what's happening. I was telling Kelsey that I'm actually now starting to work on a novel, which is a crime novel that is set in the archaeological world. So I'm not leaving archaeology. I'll never leave archaeology. So now I'm working on something a little bit different, but archaeology nevertheless.
Right. And we didn't touch on that actually in our talk because we had so many other things to talk on, but I did have a question written about that. But, for those of you who are curious, in the book, every chapter does start with a very brief, like 1 to 1.5 page, like fictionalize about women in these different professions to like really set the tone. And I have a feeling that might have like tickled your fiction,
It did.
interest.
Absolutely.
Right. But I think it's so cool that you did that though, because I was just talking on Monday with Alice Hoffman, and we were talking about, because she created a book about Anne Frank before the war, in relation with the Anne Frank house. But the idea of like bringing characters to life, especially when they are something that's so ephemeral, that's hard for you to bring something into your mind, that power, it holds a lot of power to be able to do that for readers and learners.
Well, I thought it was important because I had these ideas about the women, and it seemed like it was unfair. I had those ideas in my mind, but I wasn't sharing it with readers. So I thought, yes, I'm going to try doing this. And yeah, so that's what I did.
Well, this hour has seriously just flown by. So thank you so much, Heather. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Again, for everybody, I highly recommend picking up a copy of The Northwomen, available from the Learned Owl or your book choice of purchase, or you could even from our local library. And Heather, good luck to you with all of your writing, and I cannot
Thank you.
wait to read more from you in the future.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks for a really interesting conversation here. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. Best everybody, and everyone have a great evening. Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.